The rain pounded against the carriage windows like angry fists demanding entry. Inside, Margaret Pierce clutched her husband's arm as their horses struggled against the muddy Wyoming road. "James, perhaps we should turn back," Margaret whispered, her voice nearly drowned by thunder. "The bridge ahead might not be safe in this storm." James Pierce, a tall man with kind eyes now creased with concern, nodded. "You may be right, my dear. Sullivan's Crossing can be treacherous even in good weather." He leaned forward to instruct the driver when Margaret gasped. Through the rain-streaked window, a shadowy figure on horseback watched them from the ridge. The figure raised what appeared to be a rifle. "James, he is!" The horses suddenly reared in panic. The carriage lurched violently as the team bolted forward, the reins seeming to have a mind of their own. The last sound Margaret Pierce heard was her husband shouting as the carriage careened toward the ravine. Then darkness. Charlotte Pierce's hands trembled as she held the telegram. The Boston Medical School dormitory suddenly felt suffocating despite its spacious accommodations. "Mr. and Mrs. Pierce. Terrible accident. Sullivan's Crossing. No survivors. Deepest condolences." Her roommate Elizabeth placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Charlotte, I'm so sorry." Charlotte folded the telegram with mechanical precision, her medical training already attempting to compartmentalize the grief threatening to overwhelm her. "I need to go home," she said, her voice hollow. "I need to see where it happened." The next day, instead of attending her advanced anatomy lecture, Charlotte found herself at the sheriff's office in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood, a weathered man with kind eyes, seemed uncomfortable as Charlotte questioned him. "Miss Pierce, it was a terrible accident. The rain had weakened the crossing. Your parents' carriage went over the edge." Charlotte studied the man's face, her doctor's training making her attentive to micro-expressions. The sheriff's eyes darted away too quickly. "May I see the accident report?" she asked. Reluctantly, he slid a folder across his desk. Charlotte flipped through it methodically, her academic mind temporarily pushing grief aside. Then she saw it, a detail that made her blood run cold. "The reins were partially cut," she read aloud. "What does this mean, Sheriff?" Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. "Likely damaged during the recovery. Rocks are sharp down in that ravine." But Charlotte had spent enough time in medical laboratories to recognize the difference between a clean cut and a jagged tear. This was the former. That evening, Charlotte methodically packed her father's old traveling desk that she'd kept in Boston. Inside, she found several letters she hadn't noticed before, all bearing the same return initials, VS. The most recent one contained a veiled threat. "Brother, some debts can only be paid in full. You've had your chance." Charlotte recognized the initials, Victor Sullivan, her father's younger brother, the man who would now control Evergreen Ranch until she returned. As she finished packing, Charlotte discovered a folded note hidden in her father's Bible. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable, though it appeared hurried. "If anything happens to your mother and me, do not trust Victor." The journey to Wyoming seemed interminable. Charlotte spent the time reviewing her medical texts, a futile attempt to distract herself from the grief and suspicion growing within her. By the time the stagecoach crested the final hill revealing Evergreen Ranch, Charlotte had formulated a plan. She would not arrive as a grieving daughter. She would arrive as an investigator. The ranch sprawled across the valley below, but even from this distance, Charlotte could see changes. The north pasture, once filled with her father's prize cattle, stood empty. The white fence surrounding her mother's garden was broken in several places. Evergreen Ranch was showing signs of neglect after just 1 month under Victor Sullivan's management. The stagecoach pulled up to the main house, a 2-story structure of local timber and stone that had once represented security to Charlotte. Now it felt like entering a stranger's home. Victor Sullivan emerged from the front door, his tall frame silhouetted against the afternoon sun. His smile didn't reach his cold blue eyes that resembled her father's but lacked their warmth. "Charlotte, my dear niece, what a sight for sore eyes." He embraced her stiffly. Charlotte returned the embrace with equal rigidity. "Uncle Victor, thank you for receiving me." "Nonsense, this is your home." The emphasis on "your" carried an undercurrent Charlotte couldn't quite interpret. "Though I must say we didn't expect you so soon. Aren't you in the middle of your studies?" Charlotte met his gaze steadily. "Family takes precedence over everything, Uncle, even medicine." Before Victor could respond, an elderly woman hurried down the porch steps. Mrs. Wilson had been the ranch's housekeeper since before Charlotte was born. The genuine emotion in her weathered face provided Charlotte her first moment of real comfort since receiving the telegram. "Miss Charlotte," Mrs. Wilson embraced her with surprising strength. "Oh, child, your dear parents." Her voice broke. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson," Charlotte whispered, allowing herself a brief moment of vulnerability before composing herself. "It's good to see a familiar face." "Yes, yes, very touching," Victor interrupted. "Mrs. Wilson, please show Charlotte to her room. I'm sure she's exhausted from her journey." As Mrs. Wilson led Charlotte upstairs, Charlotte noted how the older woman glanced nervously over her shoulder, as if afraid of being overheard. "Your room is mostly as you left it, Miss Charlotte," Mrs. Wilson explained, opening the door to Charlotte's childhood bedroom. "Though Mr. Sullivan had some of your things moved to the attic, said the room needed airing out." Charlotte surveyed the space. Her medical books were conspicuously absent from the shelves. The small writing desk where she'd penned countless letters to her parents from Boston was gone. Even the quilt her mother had made for her 16th birthday was missing. "I see," Charlotte said quietly. "In my parents' room?" Mrs. Wilson's eyes darted to the door. "Mr. Sullivan has taken the master bedroom. Your parents' personal effects were relocated." "Relocated where exactly?" "Some in storage, some—" Mrs. Wilson hesitated. "Mr. Sullivan had some items burned, said they carried too many painful memories." Charlotte felt as if she'd been struck. "He burned my parents' belongings?" Mrs. Wilson wrung her hands. "Only some papers and old clothes," he said. "I wasn't permitted to see what exactly." That night, Charlotte waited until the house fell silent before slipping from her room. The attic stairs creaked beneath her weight as she ascended with an oil lamp in hand. Among the dust-covered trunks and forgotten furniture, she found boxes labeled C. Pierce, Boston. Inside were her books, medical texts her father had proudly purchased for her education. Beneath them lay her mother's letters, carefully preserved by Charlotte Warren during her time at medical school. But it was a small wooden chest that captured her attention. Inside, she found what she was seeking: her father's ledgers. James Pierce had been meticulous about recording the ranch's finances. As Charlotte flipped through the pages, a pattern emerged: large sums withdrawn without explanation, cattle sales recorded but with discrepancies in the final amounts deposited, and recurring payments to someone identified only as TR. When she returned to her room, Charlotte discovered something she hadn't noticed before. A single red rose lay on her pillow, a gesture that might seem thoughtful, except Charlotte knew roses didn't grow on Evergreen Ranch. Someone had been in her room while she explored the attic. She slept fitfully that night, her father's warning echoing in her mind: "Do not trust Victor." The next morning, Charlotte rose early, determined to reacquaint herself with the ranch. She found Mrs. Wilson in the kitchen, kneading dough with practiced hands. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson. Is there coffee?" The older woman startled slightly. "Miss Charlotte, yes, of course." She poured a steaming cup from the pot on the stove. "Mr. Sullivan usually sleeps until 8. You have time for a proper breakfast." Charlotte accepted the coffee gratefully. "I thought I'd walk the property this morning, see what's changed." Mrs. Wilson's hand stilled briefly. "Perhaps wait for Mr. Sullivan to accompany you. There have been changes in staffing. Not all the new hands know you." "I grew up here, Mrs. Wilson. I hardly need an escort on my own property." The housekeeper leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Be careful what you say, Miss Charlotte. The walls have ears now." She glanced meaningfully toward the ceiling, where Victor's heavy footsteps could now be heard. Charlotte nodded her understanding and quickly finished her coffee. She left through the kitchen door before Victor made his way downstairs. The morning air carried the familiar scent of sage and pine that Charlotte had missed in Boston. She walked purposefully toward the barn, noting more signs of neglect: loose boards, unmucked stalls, a water trough with a slow leak. Inside the dimly lit structure, she found a young boy of perhaps 14 or 15 brushing down a chestnut mare. His dark features suggested Mexican heritage. "Good morning," Charlotte greeted him. The boy startled, nearly dropping his brush. "Miss, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you come in." "You're not in trouble," Charlotte assured him. "I'm Charlotte Pierce." Recognition dawned in the boy's eyes, followed quickly by wariness. Diego Rivera, miss. I work with the horses. You're new? I don't remember you from before I left for school. Diego nodded, his eyes darting toward the barn entrance. Been here almost 2 years, miss. Since my father... He trailed off, returning his attention to the horse. Since your father what? Charlotte pressed gently. Nothing, miss. Mr. Sullivan doesn't like us talking about the past. Charlotte was about to inquire further when a shadow fell across the barn entrance. A tall man with broad shoulders stood silhouetted against the morning light. Diego, those horses need exercise, the stranger said, his deep voice carrying authority without harshness. Take Penny and Blackjack for a run after you finish here. Yes, Mr. Hayes, Diego replied, visibly relaxing at the man's presence. The stranger stepped into the barn and Charlotte could finally see him clearly. He appeared to be in his late 20s with dark brown hair partially hidden beneath a worn hat. His green eyes assessed her with surprising intensity. You must be Miss Pierce, he said, removing his hat. Jackson Hayes. I was hired last week to help with the cattle drive. Charlotte felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity as she looked at him. Have we met before, Mr. Hayes? A flicker of something, recognition, concern, crossed his features before he shook his head. No, ma'am, I'd remember meeting a doctor. I'm not a doctor yet, Charlotte corrected. Still a student. Still impressive. Hayes replaced his hat. Not many women in medicine. Before Charlotte could respond, Victor's voice boomed from outside the barn. Charlotte, there you are. Her uncle strode in, his expression darkening when he saw Hayes. I see you've met our new hand. Just now, Charlotte confirmed, noting the tension between the two men. Well, Hayes has work to do, Victor said dismissively, and I need to show you the changes I've made to the operation. Come along. As Charlotte followed her uncle out, she glanced back to see Hayes watching her intently. Something about his gaze made her wonder if he knew more than he was letting on. Victor spent the next hour leading Charlotte around the ranch, pointing out improvements that struck her as anything but. The cattle herd was smaller, the equipment in disrepair. Most concerning were the unfamiliar men Victor had hired, rough-looking individuals who eyed Charlotte with unsettling interest. You've let Thompson and Martinez go? Charlotte asked, referring to longtime ranch hands her father had trusted implicitly. Inefficient, Victor declared. These new men work for less and ask fewer questions. By midday, Charlotte had seen enough to confirm her suspicions. Victor was running Evergreen Ranch into the ground. The question was why. That evening, Victor announced they would have a guest for dinner the following night. Theodore Reynolds, Theo to his friends. He's the bank manager in town, and a personal friend. The bank manager? Charlotte asked, suddenly recalling the TR notation in her father's ledger. Yes, Evergreen Ranch has some outstanding loans that need addressing. Victor's smile was tight. Nothing for you to worry about, my dear. Later, as Charlotte prepared for bed, she heard a soft knock at her door. Mrs. Wilson slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. Miss Charlotte, I need to warn you, she whispered urgently. Mr. Sullivan has asked me to monitor your activities, report where you go, who you talk to. Charlotte's suspicions deepened. And will you? Mrs. Wilson's aged eyes hardened with resolve. I served your parents faithfully for 20 years. My loyalty remains with the Pierce family. She pressed something into Charlotte's hand, a small iron key. Your mother gave me this before their last trip. Said if anything happened, I should give it to you when you returned. What does it open? I don't know, miss. She never said. After Mrs. Wilson left, Charlotte examined the key in the lamplight. It was old, possibly to a lockbox or small chest. She tucked it into her boot, the safest hiding place she could think of. As she extinguished her lamp, Charlotte noticed something on her windowsill that hadn't been there earlier. A small book. She lit a match to examine it. Pride and Prejudice, her mother's favorite novel. Inside the front cover, a folded note. Find Jack, he knows the truth. Mahom M for Margaret, her mother. But who was Jack? The following day passed intense anticipation of the evening's dinner guest. Charlotte used the time to explore more of the ranch, carefully noting which buildings had fallen into disrepair and which employees seemed most loyal to Victor. She observed Diego working with the horses, the boy's natural talent evident despite his youth. When Victor wasn't watching, she approached him again. Diego, how long did your father work here before you? she asked casually. The boy's hands stilled on the saddle he was polishing. 5 years, miss. He kept the books. The financial records? Charlotte's interest sharpened. What happened to him? Diego's eyes darted nervously around the stable. Mr. Sullivan said he ran off, stole some money. His voice dropped to a whisper. But my father would never steal. Never. Before Charlotte could press further, Jackson Hayes appeared at the stable door. Diego, I need your help with the fence line. The boy nodded, relief evident in his expression as he hurried away with Hayes. Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that Hayes had deliberately interrupted her conversation with Diego. Was he protecting the boy or preventing him from revealing something? That evening, Theodore Reynolds arrived precisely at 6. He was a well-dressed man in his late 40s, with thinning brown hair and calculating gray eyes behind gold-rimmed spectacles. His handshake lingered uncomfortably when Victor introduced him to Charlotte. Miss Pierce, your uncle has told me so much about you, Reynolds said, his gaze openly appraising. A medical student, no less. How progressive. Charlotte withdrew her hand politely but firmly. My father believed women deserve education as much as men, Mr. Reynolds. James always did have unconventional ideas, Reynolds replied with a thin smile. Throughout dinner, Charlotte noticed how Victor deferred to Reynolds on matters regarding the ranch's future. They spoke of expansions and modernization as if Charlotte weren't present, or as if her opinion were irrelevant. The cattle drive next month will secure enough capital for our first phase, Victor was saying, provided the bank extends our current arrangement. Reynolds dabbed his mouth with a napkin. That depends on certain assurances we've discussed. Their eyes shifted briefly to Charlotte, who pretended not to notice as she sipped her water. After dinner, the men retired to Victor's study with brandy, deliberately excluding Charlotte. Instead of retreating to her room as expected, she quietly positioned herself near the study door, which had been left slightly ajar. The girl complicates things, Reynolds was saying. I thought she would stay in Boston. She'll return once the funeral matters are settled, Victor assured him. Besides, she's the key to the whole arrangement. Without her signature, we can't proceed. And if she refuses? Victor's laugh held no humor. She won't. I can be very, persuasive when necessary. The implications chilled Charlotte to her core. Whatever scheme Victor and Reynolds had concocted, it clearly required her participation, willing or otherwise. She retreated silently to her room, her mind racing. She needed to discover exactly what Victor was planning, and she needed allies. But who could she trust? The answer came unexpectedly the following morning. Charlotte had risen early to visit her parents' graves on the small hill behind the house. As she knelt to place wildflowers on the fresh earth, a shadow fell across the graves. Jackson Hayes stood a respectful distance away, hat in hand. Pardon the intrusion, Miss Pierce. I can come back later. It's all right, Charlotte said, surprised to find she meant it. Did you know my parents, Mr. Hayes? Hayes seemed to choose his words carefully. Not directly, no, but I've heard they were good people. Fair employers. Not everyone can say the same. The implicit criticism of Victor hung in the air between them. Why are you really here, Mr. Hayes? Charlotte asked directly. You don't seem like the usual ranch hand. Hayes studied her for a long moment, as if making a decision. Perhaps we should speak somewhere more private, Miss Pierce. They walked in silence to a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, well out of sight of the main house. My name isn't simply Jackson Hayes, he finally said. It's Jackson Sullivan Hayes. The revelation struck Charlotte like physical blow. Sullivan, are you related to? Victor is my uncle, Jackson confirmed grimly. My father was Joseph Sullivan, the youngest of the 3 Sullivan brothers. He died here on Evergreen Ranch 12 years ago. Charlotte struggled to process this information. She had childhood memories of an Uncle Joseph and a cousin, but they had moved away when she was young. My father told me Uncle Joseph died in an accident. That's the official story, Jackson said bitterly. A riding accident, except my father was an expert horseman who'd been riding since childhood. You think he was murdered? Charlotte stated rather than asked. By Victor? Jackson nodded. I've spent years gathering evidence. When I heard about your parents' accident, the pattern was too similar to ignore. So you came here under a false name to investigate. To find proof, Jackson corrected, and to warn you. Victor Sullivan destroys anyone who stands between him and what he wants. Charlotte thought of the partially cut reins, the threatening letters, her father's warning. I found a note from my mother, she told him. It said to find Jack. He knows the truth. She meant you, didn't she? Pain flashed across Jackson's features. Your mother was kind to me after my father died. She must have suspected the truth even then. We need evidence, Charlotte said, her analytical mind already formulating a plan. Access to Victor's study, his correspondence, and the ledgers, Jackson added. Your father kept separate books from what Victor showed the bank. If we could find those. We will, Charlotte said with determination. And then we'll bring Victor to justice for what he's done to both our families. As they prepared to return to the ranch house, Charlotte stopped suddenly. Wait, how do I know I can trust you? This could all be an elaborate trap set by Victor. Jackson reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden carving of a horse. Your father made this for me when I was 10. You might not remember, but you were there. You said it looked more like a cow than a horse. The memory surfaced from the recesses of Charlotte's mind, a summer afternoon under the shade of an evergreen tree, her father's laughing voice, a small dark-haired boy examining a wooden carving with solemn intensity. I remember now, she said softly. You were shorter than me back then. Jackson's smile transformed his face, revealing the boy he had once been. Thankfully, that changed. As they walked back toward the ranch house, Charlotte felt the weight of grief lightening fractionally. For the first time since receiving the telegram in Boston, she didn't feel entirely alone. Neither noticed the figure watching them from the second-floor window of the main house, his cold eyes narrowing with suspicion. The next morning, Charlotte awoke to find Victor standing in her doorway, his expression thunderous. Behind him, two ranch hands dragged a bloodied Diego toward the barn. What are you doing? Charlotte demanded, hurrying to follow them. Stop this immediately! Victor ignored her, striding purposefully into the barn where he instructed the men to tie Diego to a post. The boy's face was already swollen from a beating, blood trickling from his split lip. This boy was caught stealing, Victor announced loudly as ranch hands gathered to watch, and I will not tolerate thieves on Evergreen Ranch. He uncoiled a leather whip from his belt. I didn't steal anything, Diego protested, his voice breaking with fear. I was just reading. The book was in the tack room. Reading? Victor's voice dripped with contempt. What use does a stable boy have for reading, especially ledgers that don't concern him? Charlotte pushed her way forward. Uncle Victor, this is barbaric. He's just a boy. Stay out of this, Charlotte, Victor warned, raising the whip. This is ranch business. As the whip descended, Charlotte lunged forward, placing herself between Victor and Diego. But before the lash could connect, a strong hand caught Victor's wrist in midair. Not again. Jackson Hayes' voice was quiet but carried unmistakable threat. Victor struggled to free his arm. Release me, Hayes, or you'll join him. I don't think so, Jackson replied evenly, maintaining his grip. Not unless you want every ranch hand here to know you beat children and women. The gathered workers shifted uncomfortably, murmurs of discontent spreading among them. Even Victor's newly hired men seemed disturbed by the scene. Victor jerked his arm free, his face contorted with rage. This isn't over, he hissed before storming out of the barn. Charlotte immediately knelt beside Diego, her medical training taking over as she examined his injuries. Nothing's broken, thankfully. Let's get you cleaned up. As Jackson untied the boy, he asked quietly, What ledger were you reading, Diego? Diego's eyes filled with tears. My father's. I found it hidden in the tackroom wall where he used to keep it. I just wanted to see his handwriting again. Charlotte and Jackson exchanged a significant look over the boy's head. Diego, Charlotte said gently, would you be willing to show us this ledger? It might help us understand what happened to your father. Diego hesitated, then nodded. Later, in the secluded shelter of the old hunting cabin a half-mile from the main house, Diego handed over a worn, leather-bound book. My father kept records of everything, he explained as Charlotte carefully turned the pages. He said Mr. Sullivan, the older one, your father, insisted on accurate books. The ledger revealed discrepancies matching what Charlotte had found in her father's records. Missing funds, unexplained expenses, cattle sales that didn't match bank deposits. Look at these notes. Jackson pointed to margins filled with Spanish writing. Can you translate, Diego? The boy leaned forward. Money missing again. VS took $500, claimed for repairs. No repairs made. And here, VS threatened when questioned about Chicago account. Must tell JP. JP James Pierce, Charlotte said. Your father was going to tell mine about the embezzlement. The date of this entry, Jackson noted grimly, 1 week before Diego's father disappeared. Charlotte met Diego's tear-filled eyes. Your father didn't run away, did he? Diego shook his head slowly. Mr. Sullivan, Victor, the boy's voice faltered. I saw them arguing by the North Creek. Victor had a gun. My father never came home after that. The full horror of what the boy had witnessed sank in. Diego, Charlotte said carefully, do you know where your father is now? In the ground, the boy whispered, by the old oak at Sullivan's Crossing. I visit sometimes, though there's no marker. Jackson placed a gentle hand on Diego's shoulder. You're very brave to tell us this, but now Victor knows you've seen the ledger. You're not safe here. Neither are any of us, Charlotte added, her mind racing ahead. If Victor suspects we're investigating him, he won't hesitate to silence us too. I have a plan, Jackson said after a moment's thought. But first, we need to know exactly what Victor and Reynolds are plotting. That evening, Victor announced that Theodore Reynolds would be returning for dinner the following night and bringing a lawyer. Legal matters to discuss, Victor explained vaguely when Charlotte inquired. Nothing that should concern you, my dear. Of course, Charlotte replied with feigned disinterest. I'll have Mrs. Wilson prepare something special. Once alone in her room, Charlotte changed into darker clothes and waited for the house to quiet. Just before midnight, she slipped out to meet Jackson at the prearranged location behind the smokehouse. Diego is safe, he reported immediately. I've hidden him in a cave the local Lakota showed me. No one will find him there. Good, Charlotte nodded. Now for the study. They moved silently toward the main house, entering through the kitchen, where Mrs. Wilson had deliberately left a window unlatched. The housekeeper had become an unexpected ally after Charlotte confided some of their suspicions. Victor's study was locked, but Jackson proved surprisingly adept with a set of slender tools that made short work of the mechanism. Inside, they worked methodically by the dim light of a shaded lantern, examining papers without disturbing their arrangement. Look at this, Charlotte whispered, holding up a legal document. It's a marriage contract. Jackson leaned closer to read the fine print. Between Theodore Reynolds and Charlotte Pierce. His voice hardened with anger. Victor's selling you to Reynolds to cover his debts. And this, Charlotte indicated another document. Once I'm married to Reynolds, control of my inheritance transfers to my husband. They're planning to steal Evergreen Ranch entirely. The meeting tomorrow with the lawyer, Jackson realized. They'll try to force you to sign these papers. Let them try, Charlotte said grimly. As they carefully replaced the documents, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. They froze, extinguishing the lantern. The study door swung open slowly. Theodore Reynolds stood in the doorway, a pistol gleaming in his hand. Well, well, he said quietly. It seems we have a pair of nocturnal investigators. Charlotte and Jackson remained motionless in the darkness, barely breathing. Reynolds stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him. To their surprise, he lowered the pistol. I'm not here to expose you, he said. I'm here to talk. Jackson moved slightly, positioning himself between Reynolds and Charlotte. Why should we believe you? Reynolds placed the pistol on Victor's desk and stepped back. Because I have as much reason to fear Victor Sullivan as you do. More, perhaps. You're his business partner, Charlotte countered. I'm his prisoner, Reynolds corrected bitterly. 5 years ago, I made the mistake of extending credit to Victor for a high-stakes poker game. He lost everything, then borrowed more. The cycle continued until his debt to me was so large that my bank would have failed if I reported it. So instead, you became his accomplice, Jackson accused. Reynolds didn't deny it. I made compromises I'm not proud of, but I draw the line at murder. When your parents died, Miss Pierce, I suspected Victor's involvement, but I had no proof. And now, Charlotte pressed, now I want out. Reynolds reached into his jacket and withdrew a small brass key. This opens a safe deposit box at my bank. Inside is evidence of Victor's embezzlement from Evergreen Ranch over the past decade. Your father began collecting it shortly before his death. Charlotte accepted the key cautiously. Why help us now? Reynolds' expression darkened. Because Victor's latest scheme crosses a line even I won't tolerate. He doesn't just want your signature on those marriage documents, Miss Pierce. Once the property is secured, he plans to eliminate both of us in another tragic accident. I heard him arranging it with a man named Hayes, William Hayes. Jackson inhaled sharply. You know this man? Charlotte asked, noting his reaction. William Hayes is my adoptive father, Jackson admitted, his voice strained. After my father died, my mother remarried. William raised me, taught me everything I know about tracking and investigation. He's also a hired gun, Reynolds added grimly, one of the best in the territory. The implications stunned both of them. If William Hayes was working for Victor, their plans had just become infinitely more complicated and dangerous. I need to know, Jackson said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Is William Hayes directly responsible for the deaths of Charlotte's parents? Reynolds shook his head. Victor approached him, but Hayes refused the job when he learned the targets' identities. Victor found someone else. Relief flickered briefly across Jackson's features, followed by renewed determination. We need to move quickly. If Victor suspects you've betrayed him, he already does, Reynolds admitted. That's why I came tonight. I'm leaving for Denver on the morning train. I suggest you both do the same. Running won't solve anything, Charlotte said firmly. Victor would still control Evergreen Ranch. My parents and Diego's father would go without justice. No, we need to expose Victor's crimes once and for all. Reynolds studied her with newfound respect. You have your father's courage, Miss Pierce, and his stubbornness, Jackson added with the ghost of a smile. They formulated a plan quickly. Reynolds would return to town as if nothing had changed. Charlotte would attend the meeting the following evening, appearing to consider the marriage proposal. Meanwhile, Jackson would retrieve Diego and the incriminating ledger. Victor must never suspect we've spoken, Reynolds warned as he prepared to leave. He has eyes everywhere. After Reynolds departed, Charlotte turned to Jackson. Do you trust him? Not entirely, Jackson admitted, but his fear of Victor seems genuine enough. They slipped out of the study and back toward the kitchen. As they passed the parlor, a floorboard creaked beneath Charlotte's foot. She froze, heart pounding. A moment later, Mrs. Wilson's bedroom door opened down the hall. Miss Charlotte? The housekeeper called softly. Is that you? Charlotte stepped into view while Jackson remained hidden in the shadows. Yes, Mrs. Wilson, I was just getting some water. The elderly woman's eyes narrowed knowingly. Of course, miss. Would you like me to heat some milk instead? For your nerves? Thank you, but I'll be fine. Charlotte moved toward the stairs. One moment, Miss Wilson said, approaching closely. She pressed something into Charlotte's hand. I found this among your mother's things. I think she'd want you to have it now. Charlotte waited until she was safely back in her room before examining the object. A small, leather-bound journal with her mother's initials embossed on the cover. The first entry was dated 10 years earlier, shortly after Joseph Sullivan's death. James is inconsolable over Joseph's death. He suspects Victor may have been involved, though he can't bring himself to say it aloud. The brothers argued violently the day before about the ranch finances. Joseph had discovered discrepancies in the books, money missing, cattle unaccounted for. When Joseph threatened to involve the authorities, Victor stormed off. The next day, Joseph was found dead from a riding accident. Charlotte read deep into the night, her mother's elegant handwriting revealing a decade of suspicion, investigation, and finally damning evidence. The final entry was dated just 2 days before her parents' fatal journey. We've found proof at last. The original partnership agreement Victor altered after Joseph's death. The records of embezzlement. The witness who saw Victor near Joseph's body before the authorities arrived. We leave for Denver tomorrow to place these documents with our lawyer. If anything happens to us, the evidence is hidden where all childhood treasures go, beneath the evergreen where the children played. Charlotte will remember. Dawn was breaking when Charlotte finally closed the journal, her mind reeling with its revelations. The evergreen her mother mentioned could only be one place. The ancient pine tree at the edge of the property where Charlotte, Jackson, and other ranch children had played as children. They had called it the treasure tree, burying small objects in its roots for safekeeping. As Charlotte dressed for breakfast, she gazed out her window at the distant tree, standing tall against the morning sky. She would need to find a way to search it without Victor's knowledge. But first, she had a performance to deliver at the breakfast table, the role of her life, pretending ignorance while plotting justice for her family. Victor was waiting in the dining room reading a newspaper with apparent unconcern. "Good morning, my dear niece. I trust you slept well?" "Very well, thank you, Uncle," Charlotte lied smoothly, pouring herself coffee. "I'm looking forward to meeting with Mr. Reynolds and the lawyer this evening." Victor's eyebrow raised slightly in surprise. "Are you indeed? I was under the impression you found Theodore somewhat off-putting." Charlotte adopted a practical tone. "I've been thinking about my future, Uncle. Medical school is expensive and a woman's prospects in the profession are limited. Perhaps a more traditional arrangement would be sensible." Victor studied her for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "I always said you had your father's intelligence. Speaking of your future, I've taken the liberty of inviting a few guests to dinner tomorrow evening. A small celebration of sorts, assuming all goes well tonight." "How thoughtful," Charlotte replied, inwardly seething at his presumption. "May I ask who's attending?" "Just a few business associates," Victor said vaguely, "and William Hayes, an old acquaintance who's recently arrived in town. I think you'll find him quite interesting." Charlotte maintained her composure with effort. "I look forward to meeting him." After breakfast, she walked to the stables, ostensibly to ride, but actually hoping to find Jackson. Instead, she encountered a stranger, a tall, weather-beaten man with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He was saddling a magnificent black stallion with practiced ease. "Miss Pierce, I presume," the man said, tipping his hat. "William Hayes, your uncle mentioned you might be by." Charlotte felt her blood run cold. This was Jackson's adoptive father, and Victor's hired gun. She forced a polite smile. "Mr. Hayes, I didn't realize you were already here." "Just arrived this morning," Hayes replied, his keen gaze assessing her. "Victor and I have some business to discuss." "I see," Charlotte said carefully. "And will you be staying at the ranch?" "That depends on how long our business takes," Hayes answered cryptically. "I understand you are considering a match with Theodore Reynolds." The casual mention of her supposed engagement confirmed Charlotte's suspicions that Hayes was fully aware of Victor's schemes. "Nothing is decided yet," she replied, maintaining her composure. "Decisions should never be rushed," Hayes advised, something unreadable flickering in his eyes, "especially those that last a lifetime." Before Charlotte could respond, a ranch hand called to Hayes from across the yard. With a tip of his hat, Hayes led the stallion away, leaving Charlotte to wonder if his words contained a warning. She spent the morning in careful observation of the ranch operations, noting which workers seemed loyal to Victor and which might be potential allies. By midday, she'd confirmed her original assessment. Most of the longtime hands had been replaced with rougher men who avoided her gaze. As she returned to the house for lunch, Charlotte was startled by a whistle from the small copse of trees near the garden. Jackson emerged cautiously from the shadows, beckoning her to join him. "It's not safe to meet like this," Charlotte warned as she approached. "Your father is here." Jackson's expression hardened. "I know. I saw him arrive." "Did you speak with him?" "Not yet," Jackson admitted. "I needed to warn you first. William is dangerous, Charlotte. If Victor's hired him, our situation is more precarious than we thought." "Your father refused to kill my parents," Charlotte pointed out. "Perhaps he's not entirely loyal to Victor." "William Hayes operates by his own code," Jackson explained. "He won't kill women or children directly, but he'll look the other way if someone else does. And he's not actually my father by blood, just the man who raised me after my real father was murdered." Charlotte processed this information. "We need to accelerate our plan. Tonight, after the meeting with Reynolds and the lawyer, I'll create a distraction. You search the treasure tree." "The what?" "The old pine at the north boundary," Charlotte explained. "My mother's journal indicates she and my father hid evidence there, proof of Victor's crimes." Jackson nodded. "Be careful at that meeting. Victor won't hesitate to force your cooperation if persuasion fails." "I can handle Victor," Charlotte assured him. "It's your father I'm worried about." As dusk approached, Charlotte dressed carefully for dinner, selecting a gown that projected both sophistication and innocence, the perfect image of a young woman considering matrimony. Mrs. Wilson helped with her hair, weaving a subtle warning as she worked. "Mr. Sullivan has had extra guards posted around the property, miss. Says it's because of coyotes near the chicken coop, but I've never seen armed men needed for coyotes before." Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Wilson. The housekeeper hesitated, then added in a whisper, there's talk in the kitchen that Mr. Hayes isn't just here for business. The men say he's hunting someone. A chill ran down Charlotte's spine. Did they say who? No, miss, but they seem scared of him. Theodore Reynolds arrived precisely at 7, accompanied by a thin, nervous-looking man introduced as Mr. Hargrove, the lawyer. Victor was the consummate host, all smiles and bonhomie as he ushered them into the dining room where Mrs. Wilson had prepared an elaborate meal. Throughout dinner, Charlotte maintained her facade of interested consideration as Reynolds awkwardly attempted courtship conversation. Victor dominated the discussion, outlining plans for expanding Evergreen Ranch once the partnership with Reynolds was formalized. Of course, Charlotte will want to continue her medical interests, Victor said magnanimously. Perhaps a small practice here on the ranch, tending to the workers. Actually, Charlotte interjected, I was thinking more about a proper clinic in town. With Mr. Reynolds' financial backing, of course. Reynolds seemed startled by her apparent enthusiasm. Well, that is certainly something to consider. After dinner, the men moved to Victor's study, Charlotte included this time. Hargrove spread documents across the desk, explaining the marriage contract and property arrangements in legalistic terms that Charlotte pretended to find confusing. So I would still own Evergreen Ranch? She asked innocently. Well, technically, Hargrove began, upon marriage, your property would be jointly managed, Reynolds interrupted smoothly. With your husband's guidance, naturally. Naturally, Charlotte echoed, noticing how Victor's fingers tapped impatiently on his desk. The documents simply formalize the arrangement, Victor explained, pushing them toward her. Sign here and here. Charlotte lifted the pen, appearing to consider. I'd like to read through them more carefully first. Perhaps overnight? Victor's facade of patience cracked slightly. There's no need for delay, Charlotte. Mr. Hargrove has explained everything. Still, Charlotte insisted, my father always taught me never to sign anything without reading it thoroughly first. Before Victor could object further, a commotion erupted outside, shouting, followed by a gunshot. What the devil? Victor strode to the window. Reynolds used the distraction to catch Charlotte's eye, giving her a nearly imperceptible nod. Whatever was happening outside was no accident. Victor cursed, grabbing his coat. Reynolds, stay with her. Hargrove, come with me. The moment they left, Reynolds moved quickly to the desk. We don't have much time. That distraction won't hold him long. What's happening? Charlotte asked, though she suspected Jackson's involvement. Your cousin created a diversion, something about rustlers near the north boundary. But Victor will soon realize it's false. Reynolds gathered the legal documents, shoving them into his coat. These are the only copies. Without them, they can't force you to sign immediately. Charlotte's respect for the banker increased marginally. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Don't thank me yet, he warned. Victor is more dangerous than you know, especially now that William Hayes is involved. A shadow crossed the window and Charlotte glimpsed a figure moving toward the old pine tree. Jackson, taking advantage of the diversion. She needed to ensure he had enough time. Mr. Reynolds, she said urgently, I need your help maintaining this charade a little longer. Can I count on you? Reynolds hesitated, then nodded. My redemption is long overdue, Miss Pierce. When Victor returned 20 minutes later, cursing the false alarm, he found Charlotte and Reynolds engaged in apparently earnest discussion of wedding details. Everything all right? Victor asked suspiciously. Splendid, Reynolds replied smoothly. Miss Pierce has been sharing her thoughts on suitable wedding arrangements. We were just discussing a date. Victor's eyes narrowed. And the contracts? Mr. Reynolds suggested I review them overnight, Charlotte explained, as a gesture of trust in our new partnership. Did he indeed? Victor's voice was dangerously soft. Reynolds rose from his chair. It's getting late, Victor. Perhaps we should continue this discussion tomorrow when everyone is fresh. Victor clearly wanted to object, but was constrained by the presence of Hargrove, who had returned with him. Of course. Tomorrow, then. As Reynolds and Hargrove departed, Victor fixed Charlotte with a cold stare. I don't know what game you're playing, my dear niece, but it won't succeed. You will sign those papers tomorrow, one way or another. Charlotte met his gaze without flinching. Good night, Uncle. Later, as Charlotte prepared for bed, a soft knock came at her window. She opened it to find Jackson perched precariously on the trellis outside, something clutched in his hand. "I found it," he whispered as she helped him inside, "hidden in a metal box beneath the tree roots." Jackson unfolded a weathered document, the original partnership agreement between the three Sullivan brothers, declaring equal ownership of Evergreen Ranch among them and their descendants. "This proves Victor altered the ownership records after my father died," Jackson explained. "And there's more." He produced several letters documenting Victor's embezzlement, along with a sworn statement from a ranch hand who had witnessed Victor near Joseph's body before reporting the accident. "These would be enough to arrest him," Charlotte said, hope rising within her. "Yes, but we need to get them to the authorities immediately. Victor suspects something. He's doubled the guards around the property." Charlotte considered their options. "Tomorrow night, Victor is hosting a dinner for business associates. During the commotion, we can slip away." "It's risky," Jackson warned. "Everything about this is risky," Charlotte countered, "but it's our best chance." As Jackson prepared to leave, Charlotte suddenly grasped his arm. "Wait, what about your father? William Hayes is still a wild card in all this." Jackson's expression darkened. "Leave William to me. I know how to handle him." After Jackson departed, Charlotte carefully hid the documents inside her mother's journal, which she then concealed within the lining of her medical bag, the one place Victor would never look. She slept fitfully, dreams filled with racing carriages and cut reins, waking with the certainty that the coming day would determine not just her future, but whether justice would finally be served for those who had been silenced. Little did she know that Victor Sullivan had spent the night plotting as well, and his plans for Charlotte Pierce did not include a future at all. The morning of Theodore Reynolds' second visit dawned with an oppressive heat unusual for early summer. Charlotte dressed carefully, selecting a modest blue dress that had been her mother's favorite. As she pinned her hair, she rehearsed her role for the evening, the dutiful niece considering a marriage proposal for practical reasons. The reflection staring back at her from the mirror showed nothing of the determination burning within. A soft knock at her door revealed Mrs. Wilson with a breakfast tray. "Mr. Sullivan said you might prefer to eat in your room this morning." "Miss Charlotte?" The housekeeper's expression conveyed what her words could not. This wasn't a courtesy, but a way to isolate her. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson." Charlotte accepted the tray, noticing a folded note tucked beneath the napkin. She waited until the door closed before retrieving it. In cramped handwriting, "Stable, noon, important. J.H. Jackson Hayes wanted to meet." Charlotte's pulse quickened as she burned the note in the small fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken until no evidence remained. At precisely noon, Charlotte made her way to the stables under the pretense of examining her old mare, Willow. The large barn was eerily quiet, most hands out working the property. She found Jackson in the tack room, his tall frame partially hidden among the saddles and bridles. "Miss Pierce," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Thank you for coming." "Your note suggested urgency, Mr. Hayes," Charlotte replied, keeping her voice low despite the apparent emptiness of the barn. Jackson stepped closer, his green eyes intense. "I need to tell you something about myself. My name isn't simply Jackson Hayes, it's Jackson Sullivan Hayes." The revelation struck Charlotte like a physical blow. "Sullivan, are you related to—" "Victor is my uncle," Jackson confirmed grimly. "My father was Joseph Sullivan, the youngest of the three Sullivan brothers. He died here on Evergreen Ranch 12 years ago." Charlotte struggled to process this information. She had childhood memories of an Uncle Joseph and a cousin, but they had moved away when she was young. "My father told me Uncle Joseph died in an accident." "That's the official story," Jackson said bitterly. "A riding accident, except my father was an expert horseman who'd been riding since childhood." "You think he was murdered?" Charlotte stated rather than asked, the pattern becoming clear. "By Victor." Jackson nodded, his jaw tight with old anger. "I've spent years gathering evidence. When I heard about your parents' accident, the pattern was too similar to ignore." "So you came here under a false name to investigate," Charlotte concluded, pieces falling into place. "To find proof," Jackson corrected, "and to warn you. Victor Sullivan destroys anyone who stands between him and what he wants." Charlotte thought of the partially cut reins, the threatening letters, her father's warning. "I found a note from my mother," she told him. It said to find Jack. He knows the truth. She meant you, didn't she? Pain flashed across Jackson's features, softening the hard planes of his face momentarily. Your mother was kind to me after my father died. She must have suspected the truth even then. A sound from outside froze them both. Jackson quickly grabbed a saddle, pretending to inspect it as Diego entered the tack room. The boy's eyes widened at seeing them together. Miss Pierce, Mr. Hayes. His gaze darted between them nervously. It's all right, Diego, Jackson said quietly. Miss Pierce knows who I am. Relief crossed Diego's young face. I've been wanting to tell you, miss. Mr. Hayes has been helping me read better, and he knows about my father. Your father? Charlotte questioned. Diego's expression darkened. Eduardo Rivera. He was the bookkeeper here before his voice trailed off. Before he disappeared, Jackson finished. Diego believes Victor was involved. Not believes, Diego corrected with sudden fierceness. I saw. I was hiding in the trees by North Creek. Mr. Sullivan was shouting at my father about missing money. Then there was a gunshot. The boy's voice cracked. I ran away. When I came back later, there was blood on the rocks, but my father was gone. Charlotte's medical mind calculated the trauma of such a young boy witnessing his father's murder, then living under the same roof as the killer. Diego, I'm so sorry. We need evidence, Jackson said, bringing them back to the immediate problem. Access to Victor's study, his correspondence. And the ledgers, Charlotte added. My father kept separate books from what Victor showed the bank. If we could find those... We will, Jackson assured her. But first, Diego needs to show us something. The boy led them to a loose stone in the stable wall. Behind it was a worn leather ledger. My father's, Diego explained. He kept records of everything. Charlotte examined the book carefully. The neat handwriting documented years of financial transactions at Evergreen Ranch and the steady disappearance of funds under Victor's manipulation. Look at these notes, Jackson pointed to margins filled with Spanish writing. Diego translated. Money missing again. VS took 500, claimed for repairs. No repairs made. And here, VS threatened when questioned about Chicago account. Must tell JP. JP James Pierce, Charlotte said. Your father was going to tell mine about the embezzlement. The date of this entry, Jackson noted grimly, 1 week before Diego's father disappeared. Charlotte closed the ledger, her mind racing. We need to get into Victor's study tonight, before Reynolds arrives. It's locked when he's not there, Diego warned. Jackson produced a small leather case from his pocket. Locks can be persuaded. As dusk approached, Charlotte heard Victor leave for his usual pre-dinner ride. She quickly signaled to Jackson, who was pretending to repair a fence near the house. They met at the kitchen door where Mrs. Wilson had deliberately left it unlocked. 5 minutes, the housekeeper whispered. I'll try to delay him if he returns early. Victor's study was dark and imposing, heavy curtains blocking the fading sunlight. Jackson made quick work of the lock, and they slipped inside. Charlotte lit a small lamp while Jackson secured the door. Look for anything related to my parents, Charlotte instructed, moving toward the massive oak desk. They worked methodically, careful not to disturb anything noticeably. In the bottom drawer, Charlotte discovered what they were seeking, a leather portfolio stamped with her father's initials. This is it, she whispered, opening it carefully. Inside were legal documents, the top one causing her breath to catch. Look at this. It's a marriage contract. Jackson leaned closer, reading over her shoulder. Between Theodore Reynolds and Charlotte Pierce. His voice hardened with anger. Victor's selling you to Reynolds to cover his debts. And this, Charlotte indicated another document. Once I'm married to Reynolds, control of my inheritance transfers to my husband. They're planning to steal Evergreen Ranch entirely. As they carefully replaced the documents, a floorboard creaked in the hallway. They froze, extinguishing the lamp. The study door swung open slowly, revealing a silhouette Charlotte recognized as Theodore Reynolds. Well, well, he said quietly, closing the door behind him. It seems we have a pair of nocturnal investigators. Jackson positioned himself protectively between Reynolds and Charlotte, his hand moving to his belt where Charlotte suspected he kept a knife. To their surprise, Reynolds placed his pistol on Victor's desk and stepped back. I'm not here to expose you. I'm here to talk. Why should we believe you? Jackson demanded, his stance remaining defensive. Because I have as much reason to fear Victor Sullivan as you do. More, perhaps. Reynolds removed his glasses, suddenly looking older and more vulnerable. I've made terrible compromises, Miss Pierce, but I draw the line at murder. You're his business partner, Charlotte countered skeptically. I'm his prisoner, Reynolds corrected bitterly. 5 years ago, I made the mistake of extending credit to Victor for a high-stakes poker game. He lost everything, then borrowed more. The cycle continued until his debt to me was so large that my bank would have failed if I reported it. So instead, you became his accomplice, Jackson accused. Reynolds didn't deny it. When your parents died, Miss Pierce, I suspected Victor's involvement, but I had no proof. And now, Charlotte pressed. Reynolds reached into his jacket and withdrew a small brass key. This opens a safe deposit box at my bank. Inside is evidence of Victor's embezzlement from Evergreen Ranch. Your father began collecting it shortly before his death. Charlotte accepted the key cautiously. Why help us now? Reynolds' expression darkened. Because Victor's latest scheme crosses a line even I won't tolerate. He doesn't just want your signature on those marriage documents. Once the property is secured, he plans to eliminate both of us in another tragic accident. I heard him arranging it with a man named Hayes, William Hayes. Jackson inhaled sharply. You know this man? Charlotte asked, noting his reaction. William Hayes is my adoptive father, Jackson admitted, his voice strained. After my father died, my mother remarried. William raised me, taught me everything about tracking and investigation. He's also a hired gun, Reynolds added grimly. One of the best in the territory. Is he responsible for the deaths of Charlotte's parents? Jackson asked, tension evident in every line of his body. Reynolds shook his head. Victor approached him, but Hayes refused when he learned the target's identities. Victor found someone else. Relief flickered briefly across Jackson's features, followed by renewed determination. We need to move quickly. If Victor suspects you've betrayed him, he already does, Reynolds admitted. That's why I came tonight. I'm leaving for Denver on the morning train. Running won't solve anything, Charlotte said firmly. Victor would still control Evergreen Ranch. My parents and Diego's father would go without justice. Reynolds studied her with newfound respect. You have your father's courage, Miss Pierce. They formulated a plan quickly. Reynolds would return to town as if nothing had changed. Charlotte would attend the meeting the following evening, appearing to consider the marriage proposal. Meanwhile, Jackson would retrieve Diego and the incriminating ledger. After Reynolds departed, Charlotte turned to Jackson. Do you trust him? Not entirely, but his fear of Victor seems genuine enough. Later that night, Miss Wilson pressed a leather-bound journal into Charlotte's hand. I found this among your mother's things. She'd want you to have it now. The journal's first entry was dated shortly after Joseph Sullivan's death. James is inconsolable over Joseph's death. He suspects Victor may have been involved. The brothers argued violently the day before about ranch finances. Joseph had discovered discrepancies, money missing, cattle unaccounted for. When Joseph threatened to involve authorities, Victor stormed off. The next day, Joseph was found dead from a riding accident. Charlotte read deep into the night, her mother's elegant handwriting revealing a decade of suspicion, investigation, and finally damning evidence. The final entry was dated just before her parents' fatal journey. We've found proof at last. The original partnership agreement Victor altered after Joseph's death. The records of embezzlement. The witness who saw Victor near Joseph's body. We leave for Denver tomorrow to place these documents with our lawyer. If anything happens to us, the evidence is hidden where all childhood treasures go, beneath the evergreen where the children played. Charlotte will remember. The evergreen her mother mentioned could only be one place. The ancient pine tree at the edge of the property where Charlotte, Jackson, and other ranch children had played. They had called it the treasure tree, burying small objects in its roots. Charlotte slept fitfully, dreams filled with racing carriages and cut reins, waking with the certainty that the coming day would determine whether justice would finally be served for those who had been silenced. The following morning, Charlotte was startled by commotion in the yard. From her window, she saw Victor berating Diego, who stood with head bowed, shoulders hunched in anticipation of a blow. Thief, Victor's voice carried clearly. I found you with this. He waved what appeared to be Eduardo's ledger. Charlotte rushed downstairs and out the front door. Uncle Victor, what's happening? Victor turned, his face flushed with rage. This boy was caught stealing and reading private documents. Diego's frightened eyes met Charlotte's briefly. I didn't steal anything, Miss Pierce. I was just reading my father's book. His father? Victor scoffed. His father was a thief who ran off with ranch money. Like father, like son. I don't believe that, Charlotte said firmly, positioning herself beside Diego. And regardless, this doesn't justify such treatment. Stay out of this, Charlotte. Victor's voice dropped dangerously. This is ranch business. Victor raised his hand, and Charlotte realized with horror that he held a riding crop. As the whip descended toward Diego, Charlotte moved without thinking, placing herself between them. The blow never landed. A strong hand caught Victor's wrist mid-strike. Not again. Jackson Hayes' voice was quiet but carried unmistakable threat. Victor struggled to free his arm, fury contorting his features. Release me, Hayes, or you'll join him. I don't think so, Jackson replied evenly, maintaining his grip. Not unless you want every hand here to know you beat children and women. The gathered workers shifted uncomfortably, murmurs of discontent spreading among them. Even Victor's newly hired men seemed disturbed by the scene. Victor jerked his arm free, his face contorted with rage. This isn't over, he hissed before storming toward the house, the ledger still clutched in his hand. Charlotte immediately examined Diego's face, relieved to find no serious injuries. Are you all right? The boy nodded, though his eyes remained fearful. He found the ledger. I was stupid. I went back to check it was still hidden, but he must have followed me. It's not your fault, Jackson assured him, but you're not safe here anymore. We need to move you somewhere Victor can't find you. I know a place, Diego said quietly. In the hills. My father showed me once. Jackson nodded. I'll take you there tonight. For now, stay out of Victor's way. As they separated, Charlotte whispered to Jackson, tonight's dinner is our chance. Victor will be occupied with Reynolds and the lawyer. You can search the treasure tree while I keep them distracted. Be careful, Jackson warned. Victor's dangerous, especially when cornered. Charlotte returned to the house to find Victor waiting in the parlor, his composure restored, but his eyes still glittering with suppressed rage. That was quite a display of heroics, my dear niece, he remarked with false pleasantry. Quite unnecessary, I assure you. Ranch discipline might seem harsh to your city-educated sensibilities, but it's necessary. Beating a child is never necessary, Uncle, Charlotte replied coldly. Victor studied her for a moment, then changed tactics. I apologize if I upset you. Tensions are high with the cattle drive approaching. He gestured to the sofa. Please sit. We should discuss tonight's dinner. It's important everything goes smoothly. Charlotte sat cautiously, maintaining her composure despite the revulsion she felt. What exactly are Mr. Reynolds and the lawyer coming to discuss? Your future, my dear, Victor explained with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Theodore has expressed interest in you. A formal courtship would benefit everyone. His bank holds significant loans on Evergreen Ranch, and an alliance between our families would secure your inheritance. I see, Charlotte said, feigning thoughtfulness. A business arrangement masquerading as matrimony. Victor chuckled. You always were clever, Charlotte, just like your father. His expression hardened slightly. Too clever, sometimes. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Charlotte maintained her facade of calm consideration. I'll hear Mr. Reynolds out, Uncle. That's all I can promise for now. That's all I ask. Victor rose, signaling the end of their conversation. Wear the green dress tonight. It brings out your eyes. As he left the room, Charlotte felt a chill, despite the summer heat. Victor was setting his trap, confident of success. She would need to play her part perfectly if their plan had any chance of succeeding. That afternoon, Charlotte encountered William Hayes near the barn. The older man was examining saddles with the critical eye of an expert. Mr. Hayes, she acknowledged, studying him carefully. This was Jackson's adoptive father, the man who had refused to kill her parents but now worked for Victor. Hayes tipped his hat. Miss Pierce, settling in all right? As well as can be expected, considering the circumstances. Charlotte watched his face for any reaction. You've known my uncle long? Long enough. Hayes's weathered face revealed nothing. Victor Sullivan and I have crossed paths many times over the years. Professional relationship? What profession would that be exactly? Charlotte asked boldly. Hayes's eyes, gray and cold as winter sky, assessed her with new interest. Problem solving, you might say, for those who can afford my services. And what problem has my uncle hired you to solve, Mr. Hayes? The hint of a smile touched Hayes's lips. Curious nature, just like your mother. She asked too many questions, too. Charlotte felt her heart skip. You knew my mother? Margaret Pierce was a remarkable woman. Her death was unfortunate. Hayes picked up a saddle blanket, examining it with apparent interest. Be careful, Miss Pierce. Curiosity has consequences in this territory. Before Charlotte could respond, Hayes walked away, leaving her with the disturbing sense that she had just been both warned and threatened. Evening arrived with oppressive heat still lingering in the air. Charlotte dressed as instructed in the green silk gown her mother had given her for her 21st birthday. Her reflection showed a composed young woman, giving no hint of the turmoil within. Mrs. Wilson helped with her hair, murmuring softly, Mr. Reynolds arrived early. He's with your uncle in the study. The lawyer is expected shortly. Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. And thank you for everything else as well. Charlotte squeezed the older woman's hand briefly. Your parents were good people, Mrs. Wilson replied, her eyes misting. They deserve better than what happened to them. The dinner proceeded with excruciating slowness. Victor dominated the conversation, outlining plans for expanding Evergreen Ranch once the partnership with Reynolds was formalized. Reynolds played his part well, appearing enthusiastic while occasionally catching Charlotte's eye with subtle signals. Of course, Charlotte will want to continue her medical interests, Victor said magnanimously. Perhaps a small practice here on the ranch, tending to the workers. Actually, Charlotte interjected, maintaining her pretense. I was thinking more about a proper clinic in town, with Mr. Reynolds' financial backing, of course. Reynolds nodded, appearing pleased by her apparent enthusiasm. Certainly something to consider. After dinner, they moved to Victor's study where the lawyer, a nervous man named Hargrove, spread documents across the desk. These contracts formalize the arrangement, Victor explained, pushing papers toward Charlotte. Sign here and here. Charlotte lifted the pen, appearing to consider. I'd like to read through them more carefully first. Perhaps overnight? Victor's facade of patience cracked slightly. There's no need for delay, Charlotte. Mr. Hargrove has explained everything. Still, Charlotte insisted, my father always taught me never to sign anything without reading it thoroughly. Before Victor could object further, a commotion erupted outside, shouting, followed by a gunshot. What the devil? Victor strode to the window. Reynolds caught Charlotte's eye, giving her a nearly imperceptible nod. Whatever was happening outside was part of their plan. Victor cursed, grabbing his coat. Reynolds, stay with her. Hargrove, come with me. The moment they left, Reynolds moved quickly to the desk. We don't have much time. That distraction won't hold him long. What's happening? Charlotte asked, though she suspected Jackson's involvement. Your cousin created a diversion, something about rustlers near the north boundary. But Victor will soon realize it's false. Reynolds gathered the legal documents, shoving them into his coat. These are the only copies. Without them, they can't force you to sign immediately. A shadow crossed the window, Jackson taking advantage of the diversion. Charlotte needed to ensure he had enough time. Mr. Reynolds, she said urgently, I need your help maintaining this charade a little longer. When Victor returned 20 minutes later, cursing the false alarm, he found Charlotte and Reynolds engaged in apparently earnest discussion of wedding details. Everything all right? Victor asked suspiciously. Splendid, Reynolds replied smoothly. Miss Pierce has been sharing her thoughts on wedding arrangements. We were just discussing a date. And the contracts? Mr. Reynolds suggested I review them overnight, Charlotte explained, as a gesture of trust in our partnership. Victor's eyes narrowed dangerously. Did he indeed? Reynolds rose from his chair. It's getting late, Victor. Perhaps we should continue this discussion tomorrow when everyone is fresh. After Reynolds and Hargrove departed, Victor fixed Charlotte with a cold stare. I don't know what game you're playing, my dear niece, but it won't succeed. You will sign those papers tomorrow, one way or another. Later that night, a soft knock came at Charlotte's window. Jackson perched precariously on the trellis outside, his expression triumphant. I found it, he whispered as Charlotte helped him inside, hidden in a metal box beneath the tree roots. Jackson unfolded a weathered document, the original partnership agreement between the three Sullivan brothers, declaring equal ownership of Evergreen Ranch among them and their descendants. This proves Victor altered the ownership records after my father died, Jackson explained, producing several letters documenting Victor's embezzlement, along with a sworn statement from a ranch hand who had witnessed Victor near Joseph's body before reporting the accident. These would be enough to arrest him, Charlotte said, hope rising within her. Yes, but we need to get them to the authorities immediately. Victor suspects something. He's doubled the guards around the property. Charlotte considered their options. Tomorrow night, Victor is hosting a dinner for business associates. During the commotion, we can slip away. As Jackson prepared to leave, Charlotte grasped his arm. Wait, what about your father? William Hayes is still a wild card. Jackson's expression darkened. Leave William to me. I know how to handle him. After Jackson departed, Charlotte carefully hid the documents inside her mother's journal, which she then concealed within her medical bag. Sleep eluded her as she considered the dangers ahead. Victor wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened his plans. Tomorrow would determine not just her future, but whether justice would finally be served. The next morning, Charlotte found Victor in surprisingly good spirits at breakfast. I've had a thought, my dear, he announced. Rather than press you on the contracts today, why not join us for a special celebration dinner tonight? Several important business associates are coming. It would be the perfect opportunity to introduce you to society as Theodore's intended. Charlotte feigned pleasure at the invitation. That sounds lovely, Uncle. Thank you for being patient with me. Victor patted her hand with false affection. Family takes care of its own, Charlotte. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Charlotte packed a small bag with essential items and the incriminating documents, hiding it beneath her bed. She wrote a brief note to Mrs. Wilson, thanking her for her loyalty and assuring her she would be safe. At dusk, Mrs. Wilson helped Charlotte dress for dinner, her fingers trembling slightly as she fastened the buttons on Charlotte's blue silk gown. I may not see you again after tonight, Mrs. Wilson, Charlotte said quietly. The housekeeper nodded, understanding in her eyes. Your parents would be proud of you, Miss Charlotte. Be careful. The dining room was filled with cigar smoke and masculine laughter when Charlotte entered. 6 men turned to appraise her, Victor rising to make introductions. Gentlemen, my niece, Charlotte Pierce. Charlotte recognized Theodore Reynolds, who gave her a subtle nod. William Hayes sat at the far end of the table, his expression unreadable. The others were strangers, wealthy ranchers and businessmen from surrounding territories. Victor seated Charlotte at his right hand, opposite Reynolds. Charlotte has recently returned from medical school in Boston, he explained to the table. She's considering a more traditional path now, however. Dinner progressed with tedious conversation about cattle prices and railroad expansion. Charlotte noted that William Hayes said little, his watchful eyes missing nothing. Halfway through the meal, she excused herself briefly, claiming a need for fresh air. In the hallway, she slipped her prepared bag behind a large potted plant, ready for their escape. Returning to the dining room, Charlotte found the conversation had turned to her parents. Terrible tragedy, one man was saying. James Pierce was a fine cattleman, never understood how he lost control of that carriage. Victor's expression tightened momentarily. Some things defy explanation. More wine, Charlotte? As the evening progressed, Charlotte watched the clock anxiously. Jackson would be waiting at the prearranged location with Diego. At precisely 9 o'clock, the distraction they had planned should begin. Right on schedule, a commotion erupted outside, shouts followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. The men leapt to their feet, Victor cursing as he moved to the window. Fire! The north barn is ablaze! In the ensuing chaos, Charlotte retrieved her hidden bag and slipped out the back door. She moved quickly through the darkness toward the old hunting cabin where Jackson and Diego waited. She was halfway there when a voice stopped her cold. Going somewhere, Miss Pierce? William Hayes stepped from the shadows, his pistol aimed directly at her heart. Charlotte froze, her mind racing. Mr. Hayes, Victor suspected you might try something tonight, Hayes said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. Sent me to keep an eye on you. Are you going to kill me, Mr. Hayes, like Victor wanted you to kill my parents? Hayes's expression didn't change. I don't kill women or children. Professional standard. Yet you work for a man who does. Business is business. Hayes gestured with his pistol. Let's go back to the house. Victor will want to speak with you. Charlotte stood her ground. You raised Jackson to be honorable. How can you serve a man who murdered his father? For the first time, Hayes's composure slipped. Jackson? What do you know about my son? He's here, Charlotte said, deciding to gamble everything. He came to find justice for his father, for Joseph Sullivan. Hayes's eyes narrowed. Joseph Sullivan died in a riding accident. We both know that's a lie. Victor killed him, just like he arranged the deaths of my parents. Charlotte took a calculated risk, stepping closer. Jackson found proof. It's in this bag. For a long moment, Hayes stood motionless. Then he lowered his pistol slightly. Show me. Charlotte carefully opened her bag, removing the original partnership agreement and the witness statement. Hayes examined them, his weathered face revealing nothing. Where's Jackson now? He finally asked. Waiting for me. We're taking these documents to the authorities. Hayes seemed to come to a decision. Victor's men are searching the property. You won't make it past them. We have to try, Charlotte insisted. For justice, Maisha. Hayes holstered his pistol. There's another way out, through the old mining tunnel on the North Ridge. Victor doesn't know about it. Charlotte stared at him, barely daring to hope. You're helping us? I'm helping my son, Hayes corrected, and paying an old debt. What debt? To your mother. She once saved my life years ago when no one else would help. Hayes's face softened momentarily. Margaret Pierce was a good woman. She didn't deserve what happened to her. A shout in the distance reminded them of the danger. Hayes took Charlotte's elbow, guiding her toward a different path than she had planned. This way, and move quietly. They traveled swiftly through the darkness, avoiding the search parties Victor had dispatched. At the base of the North Ridge, Jackson emerged from the shadows, his expression hardening when he saw his adoptive father. William, his hand moved to his gun. Easy, son, Hayes said calmly. I'm here to help. Diego appeared behind Jackson, his young face fearful. Mr. Hayes works for Sullivan. Not anymore, Hayes replied. Let's say I've reconsidered my employment options. Jackson looked to Charlotte for confirmation. She nodded. He's helping us escape, Jackson. He knows another way out. For a tense moment, Jackson seemed torn between suspicion and hope. Finally, he lowered his hand. Lead the way, then. The mining tunnel seemed endless, its rough walls pressing in around them as they navigated by the flickering lantern light. Charlotte led the way, her medical bag clutched tightly against her side, while Jackson followed with Diego between them for safety. The boy's face was etched with exhaustion, but determination kept him moving forward. How much further? Diego whispered after what felt like hours of walking. Not far now, Jackson assured him, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. The ridge isn't that wide. Charlotte paused at a fork in the tunnel, raising the lantern higher. Which way? Jackson examined both passages, crouching to study the ground. This way, he finally decided, pointing to the right-hand tunnel. The air feels fresher. They continued in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Charlotte couldn't help wondering about William Hayes and the confrontation he had returned to face with Victor. Had his sacrifice given them enough time to escape? Would they ever know what truly happened back at the ranch? The descent from the ridge took another hour, made treacherous by loose shale and the exhaustion that weighed on all three travelers. By the time they reached the outskirts of Riverdale, the sun had fully risen and casting long shadows across the quiet streets. The sheriff's office should be on the main street, Charlotte said, adjusting her appearance as best she could. Despite her efforts, she knew she must look a sight, her elegant dinner dress torn and dirty, her hair falling from its pins. Wait, Jackson said suddenly, pulling them into the shadow of a building. Look. Two riders were moving slowly down the street ahead, their eyes scanning doorways and alleys. Charlotte recognized them immediately as men from Victor's ranch. He's already sent men ahead. She whispered ominously. They must have ridden through the night. We need to be careful, Jackson agreed. They don't know we're here yet, but they'll be watching the sheriff's office. What do we do? Diego asked, fear returning to his voice. Charlotte considered their options. We need help, someone Victor doesn't control. The church, Jackson suggested, pointing to a white steeple rising above the buildings. Victor's not a religious man. He's unlikely to have influence there. They made their way cautiously through back alleys until they reached the small church on the edge of town. The door was unlocked. the interior cool and quiet in the early morning light. A middle-aged man in clerical collar looked up in surprise from where he was arranging hymnals. "Can I help you?" he asked, taking in their disheveled appearance with concern rather than judgment. "We need sanctuary," Charlotte explained, "and help reaching Sheriff Denton without being seen." The pastor, who introduced himself as Reverend Thomas Miller, listened gravely as they explained their situation. His expression darkened at the mention of Victor Sullivan. "I've heard rumors about Evergreen Ranch for years," he admitted, "but Victor's influence extends far in these parts. Even Sheriff Denton treads carefully around him." "Will you help us?" Jackson pressed. Reverend Miller nodded without hesitation. "Wait here. I'll bring the sheriff to you." While they waited, Charlotte organized the documents they'd gathered: her mother's journal, the original partnership agreement, Eduardo's ledger, and the witness statements. Together, they told a damning story of Victor Sullivan's decades of crime. "Do you think it will be enough?" Diego asked, watching her work. "It has to be," Charlotte replied, though doubt gnawed at her. Victor had evaded justice for years. Would today be any different? An hour later, the church door opened to admit Reverend Miller, accompanied by a tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Denton was younger than Charlotte had expected, perhaps 40, with intelligent eyes that assessed them carefully. "Reverend Miller says you have serious accusations against Victor Sullivan," he said without preamble. Charlotte straightened her shoulders. "Not accusations, Sheriff. Evidence." Over the next hour, they presented their case, the financial records showing embezzlement, the altered partnership agreement, her mother's journal documenting years of suspicion and investigation, and finally, Diego's eyewitness account of his father's murder. Sheriff Denton listened without interruption, occasionally examining a document more closely. When they finished, he leaned back, his expression grave. "This is certainly compelling," he acknowledged, "but Victor Sullivan is a powerful man with friends in the territorial government. Moving against him won't be simple." "Are you saying you won't help us?" Jackson demanded, frustration evident in his voice. Denton held up a placating hand. "I didn't say that. I'm saying we need to be strategic. If I ride out to Evergreen Ranch now with just these papers, it could end badly for all of us." "What do you suggest?" Charlotte asked. "Judge Parker arrives on tomorrow's train for circuit court. He's known for his impartiality and courage. If we present this evidence to him, he can issue warrants that even Sullivan's friends can't ignore." Denton turned to Diego. "And the boy's testimony about witnessing his father's murder will be crucial." "We can't wait until tomorrow," Jackson objected. "Victor knows we've escaped. He'll be looking for us." "You'll be safe here," Reverend Miller assured them. "The church has rooms where travelers sometimes stay. No one will think to look for you here." Denton nodded agreement. "I'll post deputies I trust to watch the church discreetly. In the meantime, I'll telegraph the marshal in Cheyenne. This case may be bigger than my jurisdiction." It wasn't the immediate action Charlotte had hoped for, but she recognized the wisdom in Denton's caution. One mistake now could undo everything they'd sacrificed to achieve. "Very well," she conceded. "We'll wait for Judge Parker." After Denton departed, Reverend Miller showed them to small but clean rooms behind the church. "Rest now," he advised. "You've had a long journey through the night. Judge Parker's train arrives tomorrow afternoon." Charlotte nodded gratefully. It had been 24 hours since they'd fled Evergreen Ranch through the mining tunnel, and exhaustion weighed heavily on all of them. Still, despite her fatigue, sleep eluded her. She sat by the window, watching the street below for any sign of Victor's men. The afternoon of their first day in Riverdale lengthened into evening without incident, and she had almost begun to relax when a knock came at her door. Jackson stood in the hallway, his expression tense. "Come quickly. Something's happened." In the church office, Sheriff Denton had returned with grave news. "There was a fire at Evergreen Ranch last night," he reported. "The main house was destroyed." Charlotte gasped. "Was anyone hurt?" "3 men are confirmed dead," Denton said heavily. "Victor Sullivan, William Hayes, and Theodore Reynolds." Jackson sank into a chair, his face ashen. "William, are you certain?" Sheriff Denton had returned with grave news. "There was a fire at Evergreen Ranch last night," he reported. "The main house was destroyed." Charlotte gasped. "Was anyone hurt?" "3 men are confirmed dead," Denton said heavily. "Victor Sullivan, William Hayes, and Theodore Reynolds." Jackson sank into a chair, his face ashen. The memory of his adoptive father's gray eyes, cold yet somehow knowing, flashed in his mind. William, are you certain? The bodies were badly burned, but they've been identified by ranch hands, Denton confirmed. According to witnesses, Hayes confronted Sullivan after your escape. There was gunfire, then the fire broke out. By the time help arrived, the house was engulfed. Charlotte tried to process the news. Victor was dead, their tormentor gone, justice served by fire rather than law. But at what cost? William Hayes and Theodore Reynolds had both helped them escape, and now they too were gone. What happens now? She asked quietly. Judge Parker will still want to hear your evidence, Denton replied. There are still crimes to account for, even if Sullivan has met his judgment. And there's the matter of Evergreen Ranch's rightful ownership. That night, Charlotte found Jackson outside the church staring at the stars. I'm sorry about William, she said softly. Jackson nodded, his profile sharp against the night sky. He made his choice. In the end, he did what he thought was right. He saved us, Charlotte said. Without his help, we might never have escaped. I know. Jackson's voice caught slightly. I just wish... He didn't finish the thought, but Charlotte understood. So many things left unsaid, so many years lost that could never be recovered. She placed her hand gently on his arm, offering what comfort she could in shared silence. Morning brought new developments. Sheriff Denton arrived early, accompanied by a distinguished man in a dark suit whom he introduced as Judge Edward Parker. The judge listened to their story with sharp attention, occasionally making notes. This evidence is compelling, he declared when they had finished, particularly the partnership agreement proving Mr. Sullivan altered legal documents after Joseph Sullivan's death. I'm prepared to issue rulings on ownership of Evergreen Ranch immediately. What about justice for my father? Diego asked, his young voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. Judge Parker regarded the boy with respect. Your testimony about witnessing your father's murder will be entered into the official record, young man. Though the man responsible has already faced a higher judgment, the truth deserves to be known. Legal proceedings moved swiftly under Judge Parker's efficient direction. By afternoon, he had issued his rulings. Evergreen Ranch was to be divided equally between its rightful heirs, Charlotte Pierce and Jackson Sullivan, as the original partnership agreement stipulated. Diego Rivera was granted compensation from the estate for his father's wrongful death, along with a small parcel of land that had once belonged to Eduardo. What will you do now? Charlotte asked Diego as they left the courthouse on the afternoon of their third day in Riverdale. The boy considered the question seriously. I want to learn. My father always said education was important. You could attend school here in Riverdale, Charlotte suggested. I could arrange it. Diego shook his head. I want to see more than just Wyoming. My father used to talk about California. Then California it is, Jackson said. I have contacts in San Francisco who can help you get established. A fresh start. They spent the following day making arrangements, securing Diego's travel papers, purchasing his ticket, and settling the legal details of his inheritance. By the 5th day since their arrival in Riverdale, all was in order. As they prepared to part ways that morning, Diego embraced them both with surprising strength for one so young. All right, he promised, his eyes bright with tears and possibility. And someday I'll come back. We'll be here, Charlotte assured him, pressing a small packet into his hands. Enough money to secure his future, along with a letter of introduction to a doctor friend of her professors in San Francisco. After Diego departed on the westbound train, Charlotte and Jackson faced their own decisions. With Judge Parker's legal documents in hand establishing their ownership of Evergreen Ranch, they began the 2-day journey back to what remained of their home. The trip was somber, the landscape beautiful but now forever marked by the tragedies that had unfolded across it. The burned shell of the main house greeted them like a skeleton, blackened timbers reaching toward the sky like pleading fingers. Mrs. Wilson had survived, having been visiting her sister in town when the fire broke out. She wept when she saw Charlotte, clasping her hands with relief. I feared the worst when you disappeared, she confessed. Then when the fire started, it was terrible. So fast, like the house wanted to burn. What exactly happened? Jackson asked. Mrs. Wilson shook her head. No one knows for certain. Mr. Hayes arrived at the ranch late that night, demanding to see Mr. Sullivan. They argued in the study. Mr. Reynolds was there too. Then there were gunshots, and minutes later, flames everywhere. Charlotte surveyed the ruins thoughtfully. Had William Hayes deliberately set the fire, ensuring Victor couldn't escape? Or had it been an accident, a lantern overturned in the struggle? They would never know for certain. We'll rebuild, she decided, turning away from the charred remains. Something new, something better. It was early July when they returned, nearly 3 weeks since Charlotte had first arrived at Evergreen Ranch, seeking answers about her parents' deaths. Over the following weeks of summer, Charlotte and Jackson worked tirelessly to restore order. The cattle operation had suffered under Victor's mismanagement, but the foundations remained sound. By the end of July, several ranch hands who had left during Victor's regime began to return, bringing their families back to the land they had once loved. By mid-August, Charlotte wrote to the medical school, explaining her situation and requesting a leave of absence. 2 weeks later, the response arrived, surprisingly understanding, offering her the opportunity to resume her studies the following spring term, if she wished. The choice was now truly hers, medicine or Evergreen Ranch, or perhaps, somehow, both. Throughout those first 6 weeks back at the ranch, Jackson proved to be an excellent partner in the resurrection of their shared inheritance. His knowledge of cattle and land management complemented Charlotte's organizational skills and vision for the future. By September, they had begun planning a new main house, one designed for light and openness rather than the dark, closed spaces Victor had preferred. As summer turned to fall, with nearly 3 months past since the fateful fire, they established a new routine. Mornings were spent on ranch business. Afternoons often found Charlotte tending to medical needs in the bunkhouse she had converted to a small clinic. Word spread quickly that the doctor's daughter from Evergreen Ranch had healing hands, and soon people were traveling from neighboring ranches to seek her care. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the foreman's house they had temporarily made their home, Charlotte broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "We need to decide what happens next," she said, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and purple. "With us. With Evergreen." Jackson nodded, his profile thoughtful in the fading light. "I've been thinking about that. This land deserves better than what it's seen these past years." "I agree," Charlotte said, "which is why I've decided to stay, to make Evergreen what my parents always intended, a place of growth and healing, not secrets and pain." "And your medical studies?" Jackson asked. Charlotte smiled. "Dr. Winters from Riverdale has offered to continue my training under his supervision. It's not Boston, but it's medicine, and it's here where I'm needed." Jackson was silent for a long moment. "You know, when I came here seeking justice for my father, I never expected to find a home again." He turned to face her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she had rarely seen. "But that's what Evergreen has become for me, what you've helped it become." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibility. They had worked side by side for months now, their partnership deepening into something neither had anticipated. Charlotte found herself studying Jackson's face, the determined set of his jaw, the kindness in his eyes that even tragedy hadn't extinguished. "Then stay," she said simply. "Evergreen is as much yours as it is mine. We can rebuild it together." 3 months after their escape through the mining tunnel, Charlotte received a letter from Diego. He had settled in San Francisco, found work with a printing company, and was attending school in the evenings. His letter brimmed with excitement about his new life and gratitude for their help in securing it. "I still dream of Wyoming sometimes," he wrote, "but they're no longer nightmares. I think of the treasure tree and the hiding places I found. I think of you both and how you risked everything for truth. My father would be proud, I think. I know I am." Charlotte read the letter aloud to Jackson as they sat beneath the massive pine that had once been their childhood playground, the treasure tree that had safeguarded evidence of Victor's crimes for years. Its evergreen branches stretched toward the clear autumn sky, seemingly untouched by the tragedies that had unfolded beneath it. "We should plant more trees," Jackson suggested, looking out over the land that stretched before them. "A grove, perhaps, to replace what was lost in the fire." "I'd like that," Charlotte agreed, "something that will outlast us both." The winter that followed was harsh but beautiful. The land blanketed in pristine white that seemed to cleanse away the darker memories of the past. Charlotte and Jackson worked through the cold months planning for spring. New cattle to be purchased, fields to be planted, construction of the new main house to begin as soon as the ground thawed. Their partnership deepened with each passing day, professional respect evolving into deeper affection. Jackson taught Charlotte to track game through the snow. She shared her medical knowledge when one of the ranch hands developed pneumonia. They learned each other's strengths and weaknesses, building a foundation stronger than either had known before. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside, they sat before the fire in their small temporary home. Mrs. Wilson had outdone herself preparing a feast, then tactfully retired early, leaving them alone with mulled cider and memories. "I've been thinking about names," Jackson said suddenly. "Names?" Charlotte asked, curious at his thoughtful expression. "For the ranch. Evergreen has always been its name, but perhaps it's time for something new, a fresh start." Charlotte considered the idea. "What did you have in mind?" "Legacy Ridge," Jackson suggested, "to honor those who came before us, your parents, my father, Eduardo Rivera. Their legacy lives on through what we build here." Charlotte let the name settle in her mind, finding it fitting. "Legacy Ridge," she repeated. "I like it." Jackson reached into his pocket, producing a small wooden box. "I have something for you, an early Christmas gift." Inside was a delicately carved pendant, a miniature evergreen tree, the detail exquisite in the polished wood. "You made this," Charlotte said, recognizing his craftsmanship. "I did," he confirmed, "to remind you that even through the darkest winter, some things remain evergreen. Truth, justice, hope." He hesitated, then added more softly, "love." The word hung between them, at once question and answer. Charlotte closed her hand around the pendant, feeling its smooth contours press against her palm. "Help me put it on," she asked, turning so he could fasten the simple leather cord around her neck. His fingers were gentle as they brushed against her skin, lingering slightly longer than necessary. When she turned back to face him, their eyes met with new understanding. "Merry Christmas, Charlotte," he said softly. "Merry Christmas, Jackson," she replied, leaning forward to place a gentle kiss on his cheek. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the scars of the past beneath its pristine blanket. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in this moment of quiet connection, Charlotte felt something she had not expected to find again after her parents' deaths: peace and the promise of joy to come. Spring arrived with an explosion of green across the Wyoming landscape. Construction began on the new main house, designed with large windows to welcome light and views of the mountains beyond. Charlotte and Jackson worked alongside the builders, ensuring every detail reflected their vision for Legacy Ridge's future. In April, they received word from Diego. He had been accepted to a school for typesetting and printing, his natural talent recognized by his employers. "San Francisco is wonderful," he wrote, "but someday I will return to see what you have built at Legacy Ridge." As the new house took shape, Charlotte found herself spending more time in her small clinic, now relocated to a renovated cottage near the edge of the ranch. Word of her medical skills had spread throughout the region, bringing patients from as far as Cheyenne seeking care they couldn't find elsewhere. "You've found your calling," Jackson observed one evening as they walked together through the partially completed house, inspecting the day's progress. "Just not where you expected to find it." Charlotte smiled, running her hand along a newly installed banister. "My father always said life rarely follows the path we plan for it. The trick is to recognize the better path when it appears." "And is this the better path?" Jackson asked, watching her closely. "Legacy Ridge, medicine on your own terms?" "It is," Charlotte replied without hesitation, "though I couldn't have walked it alone." Their relationship had evolved naturally over the months of shared work and purpose. What had begun as a partnership born of necessity had deepened into something more profound. Respect blossoming into affection, and affection into love. They had not spoken of it directly, but it existed between them like a living thing, growing stronger with each passing day. In June, nearly a year after Charlotte's return to Wyoming, Judge Parker visited Legacy Ridge to see the progress for himself. He had taken a personal interest in their case, occasionally writing to check on their welfare. "Remarkable," he declared, surveying the transformed property. "You've accomplished more in a year than most could in 5. "We had good foundations to build upon," Charlotte explained. "My parents and Jackson's father laid the groundwork long ago. We're simply continuing what they started." That evening, after Judge Parker had retired to the guest cottage, Charlotte and Jackson sat on the porch of the nearly completed main house. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, silhouetting the distant mountains. "I received a letter from Boston today," Charlotte said, after a comfortable silence. "The medical school has offered me a place in next year's class. They're impressed by the work I've been doing here." Jackson nodded slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Will you accept?" Charlotte turned to face him fully. "That depends." "On what?" "On you," she said simply. "On us. On what we're building here, together." Jackson took her hand, his touch warm and familiar. "Charlotte, when I came to Evergreen Ranch, I was seeking justice for my father. I never expected to find a home, a purpose." He hesitated. "A love I never thought possible." "Is that what this is?" Charlotte asked softly. "Love? What else could it be?" Jackson replied. "We've faced death together, rebuilt a legacy from ashes, created something new and hopeful from tragedy. If that's not love, I don't know what is." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected emotion welling up. "I'm not going back to Boston," she said. "My place is here, at Legacy Ridge, with the clinic, with you." Jackson's smile transformed his face, years of tension and grief falling away. "Then stay, not just as my partner in business, but in life. Marry me, Charlotte." The question, so simply stated, so profound in its implications, hung in the air between them. Charlotte thought of the journey that had brought them here, from suspicion to trust, from shared purpose to shared heart. She thought of her parents who had died seeking truth and justice. She thought of Joseph Sullivan and Eduardo Rivera, whose deaths had gone unavenged for too long. "Yes," she said, the single word carrying the weight of all they had endured together and all they would build. "Yes, I will marry you, Jackson Sullivan." As if nature itself approved of their union, a soft breeze rustled through the newly planted evergreen saplings surrounding the house, the beginning of the grove they had envisioned during that winter evening. "Legacy Ridge," Jackson murmured, gazing out at their kingdom. "Our legacy now. And those who come after us," Charlotte added, her hand finding his. They were married in September beneath a treasure tree, Judge Parker officiating and Mrs. Wilson weeping joyfully throughout the ceremony. The ranch hands and their families gathered to witness the union, along with friends from Riverdale and surrounding ranches. Diego sent a telegram of congratulations, promising to visit at Christmas. As autumn painted the landscape in gold and crimson, Charlotte and Jackson Sullivan settled into their new life together in the completed main house of Legacy Ridge. The clinic continued to flourish, with Charlotte treating patients 3 days a week while still overseeing ranch operations alongside her husband. On a crisp October morning, nearly 18 months after her parents' deaths, Charlotte stood on the porch watching the sunrise. Jackson joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the chill. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked. Charlotte smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I was thinking about my parents and your father, wondering if they can see what we built here." "I believe they can," Jackson said with quiet certainty. "This is the legacy they always intended: truth, justice, healing." Charlotte nodded, her hand absently touching the wooden evergreen pendant she still wore daily. "I received a letter from Dr. Mitchell in Boston yesterday. He's interested in establishing a training program for frontier medicine, using our clinic as a model." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Bringing Boston to Wyoming?" "In a way," Charlotte laughed, "though I think Wyoming has more to teach Boston than the other way around." As they stood watching the sun illuminate their land, Charlotte felt a sense of completion she had not expected to find when she first returned to Wyoming seeking answers about her parents' deaths. The journey had been painful, the truth hard-won, but the result, this partnership, this love, this legacy, was worth every hardship. "We should visit the treasure tree today," she suggested. "It's been a while." Hand in hand, they walked the familiar path to the ancient pine that had safeguarded secrets and now stood as silent witness to new beginnings. Beneath its sheltering branches, Charlotte felt the presence of all who had come before. Her parents, Joseph Sullivan, even Eduardo Rivera, whose tragic death had helped reveal the truth. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if William hadn't helped us escape that night?" she asked. Jackson considered the question thoughtfully. "I used to, but I've come to believe that we make our own fate through the choices we make. William made his choice, as did Victor and Reynolds. And we made ours, Charlotte added. The best choice I ever made, Jackson affirmed, drawing her close. As they stood beneath the evergreen's spreading branches, Charlotte thought of the journey that had brought them here. From tragedy to triumph, from loss to love, Legacy Ridge stood as testament to resilience, to the enduring power of truth over deceit, of justice over corruption. And as the wind whispered through the pine needles above, Charlotte could almost hear her mother's voice. Some things remain evergreen: truth, justice, hope, love. Come, Jackson said, taking her hand. There's work waiting for us at the ranch. Together they walked back toward home, toward the future they were building day by day. Behind them, the treasure tree stood tall against the autumn sky, guardian of secrets no more. Now simply a landmark of legacy and love that would endure for generations to come. As they reached the crest of the hill overlooking the valley, Charlotte paused to take in the view of Legacy Ridge below. Where once she had seen a broken, neglected property upon her return from Boston, now stood a flourishing ranch. Fences repaired, fields tended, cattle grazing peacefully in green pastures. The new main house gleamed in the sunlight, its windows reflecting the blue Wyoming sky. "Do you think we'll ever have children to share this with?" Charlotte asked softly, the question she'd been pondering for weeks finally finding voice. Jackson's eyes met hers, warm with understanding. "I hope so. This land deserves laughter again." Charlotte nodded, her hand instinctively touching her medical bag. "De Winters says more families are moving to the territory. They'll need a doctor who understands life here, not just medicine from Boston textbooks. And their children will need stories," Jackson added, "about brave people who stood for truth even when it seemed impossible." "Like Diego," Charlotte smiled. "I received another letter from him yesterday. He's thriving in San Francisco, top of his class in penmanship. His teacher says he has a gift for storytelling." They continued down the path, past the memorial garden Charlotte had planted in honor of her parents, Joseph Sullivan and Eduardo Rivera. Simple stone markers stood among native wildflowers, a place of remembrance and peace rather than secrets and sorrow. Mrs. Wilson was waiting on the porch, her weathered hands busy with knitting what appeared to be a small blanket. She had refused to discuss her suspicions about what actually happened the night of the fire, saying only that some things are best left to the Lord's judgment. But her loyalty to Charlotte never wavered, and her eyes held a quiet satisfaction whenever Victor Sullivan's name was mentioned. "I found your mother's recipe book," the housekeeper called as they approached. "Tucked away in that old trunk from the root cellar. Thought you might want it for Sunday's dinner. We're having the Hendersons over, remember?" Charlotte smiled at this small treasure recovered from the past. "I'd like that. My father always said mother's apple pie could bring peace to the Wyoming territory." "Some traditions are worth keeping," Jackson agreed, his hand finding the small of Charlotte's back in a gesture that had become second nature. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in deepening shades of purple and gold, Charlotte sat at her desk writing in her own journal, a practice inherited from her mother. The day's entry concluded with words that would have seemed impossible months before. "Today marks 1 year since I received that terrible telegram in Boston. So much pain and loss, yet somehow also redemption. As I look out my window at Legacy Ridge, I see not just what was lost, but what has been found. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of all, the courage to begin again." She closed the journal, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. Some things, after all, do remain evergreen.